Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Lewis and Lucas podcast. I am half of your podcast, Lucas. With me today, as always, is Lewis. How are you doing today, Lewis?
I am doing well. How are you doing?
Doing good. I'm doing good. I'm excited to do another episode. This time we get to talk about somebody that sort of like when we did Nassim Taleb, both of us we're familiar with his work. He's an important figure for a lot of people. We're talking about Jordan Peterson. There's some things that ideas that he promotes that I think are good and awesome, and then there's other things that are just real head scratchers that I don't quite understand. When did you first notice Peterson, Lewis?
I can't remember when I first noticed him. I mean, I think when he blew up, what was it, 2018
17, yep.
17, and I probably noticed him with everybody else, and he's one of those guys that like trying to think of other similar people, but there's a lot of people maybe like Tim Dillon or whatever, where it's a guy that you would think of as a liberal, think of as opposed to you, and then all of a sudden they kind of wake up and they start sticking up for your side, and you like them for that reason. But then the more they like kind of become part of your side, you're like, whoa, wait a second, this guy doesn't actually agree with my side on a lot of stuff. So he kind of is in that category of a guy that you liked him because he stood up against nonsense, but then the more you got to know him, you're like, oh, okay, there's some problems here. So anyway, that's how I got to know him. I am not the same level of expert as I was with Taleb, where Taleb, I read pretty much everything he ever wrote, and actually was a pretty big fan at one point in time before turning against him. But with Peterson, I'm more like I've read 12 Rules for Life, and I've watched probably the same videos everybody else has with him owning the libs, that kind of thing. So, but I haven't read Maps of Meaning, which I know you have, and I haven't read anything else significant by him. So, but we can have a conversation. I feel like I know enough where I can talk to my opinions, and you probably know more than I do, but let's do it.
That's fine. I think, I came notice Peterson the same time, 2017. So for people who don't remember, at the time in Canada, they were looking at passing this new federal bill, C-17, that would make dead naming or misgendering somebody a federal crime, essentially. And Peterson was one of the few voices, he was an academic voice in Canada that said this is tyranny, this is fascism. And he would go on to these Canadian talk shows and start talk about how like this is really, really bad idea. This bill is tyrannical. We're policing people's speech in a way that we really, as a civilized society, we should not be doing. That brought him to international prominence. He's coming on, having reasoned conversations with people, showing people, and his opponents at that time would be like, well, like we should be doing these things out of politeness. We should be using somebody's pronouns out of politeness. To which Peterson says, absolutely. But that's not what, like, we're not talking about being polite. We're talking about making a federal crime, misgendering somebody. These are not the same thing. I really liked him for having that conversation.
Yeah,
and
it was great. Yeah, he really shined in that moment, and there's a reason he blew up. And those were all good points he made, and it was also brave for him to do. There's some courage that's required when you're an academic at a major university. There's the pressure to either go along with the woke nonsense or at least to be quiet about it has got to be overwhelming. And there's a reason why you look at polls for university professors and it's 96% Democrat and 3% independent and less than 1% Republican. Like there's a reason. It's not easy to be at all conservative in those environments, and good Absolutely. For him for standing up. That's a cool thing.
Yep. Yeah, and then he got Joe Rogan's attention, came on Joe Rogan the first time, and people started noticing him more and looking at, okay, what is he about besides being anti this particular bill? Like, what else is Jordan Peterson about? So he's a psychologist who uses religion a lot in his work, in his lectures. He's very much influenced by Carl Jung. I learned this because I picked up Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, which was his first. People think 12 Rules was, they mistakenly think that was his first published work. Maps of Meaning, and I think it was written in 1991. It was a while ago. But it's his attempt to explain how and why religion exists, why it evolves. His argument, which other people have made this argument, it's very Jungian, right? It's humans, we don't know everything about the world around us. Now in the modern era, we rely a lot on scientific discoveries to help fill in gaps. But our ancestors, who knew next to nothing about how the world worked, they would find patterns, they would find these different rules to live by that would allow them to live longer, and then build religion and mythos around those rules and patterns to teach others in their tribes how to stay alive longer. And as an example, if you're in the plains of Africa, right? You're a Paleolithic caveman and you're hunting, you hear a stir in the grass beside you. Now, it could be a lion prowling through the grass, in which case this is very dangerous. Or maybe it's just the wind. Now, your religion teaches you that when you observe those physical manifestations, more often than not, it's a spirit and you need to stay away, right? So you believe that it's actually literally a spirit and you take caution and get out of there. Now, more often than not, it's just the wind. But in those rare instances where it's actually a lion, that religious belief of this is an evil spirit and I got to get away keeps you alive in those situations. And the cost for believing that particular superstition, you just have to you're just moving out of there, right? So even if it's just the wind, don't harm, no foul. Whereas if you didn't believe in that particular superstition, you think it's the wind and it's actually a lion, well, now you're dead. Now you're lunch. So Peterson makes similar arguments for why we have religion, or as he calls them, maps of meaning, hence the title of the book. And he, spends a lot more time developing the religious icons, sort of like the hero myth. What's really frustrating, if you're familiar with the hero myth and Joseph Campbell, so I was reading Peterson and waiting for him to bring up or really acknowledge Joseph Campbell, and he doesn't really do that, which is really funny because like Peterson isn't really evolving the hero myth per se, but there's so many similarities you would expect in an academic work that he would acknowledge Joseph Campbell, rightly or wrongly, is derided by scholars as being more of a pop scientist, whatever. Fair enough. But like that part was weird, expecting him to like acknowledge other people who've worked in this area and just not mentioning them at all. But so yeah, it's an interesting book, but it's also Peter. And I want to get your take on this, Lewis. I feel like Peterson uses a ton of esoteric, highly academic language when simple words would suffice. Like when you see people making fun of the way he talks, whatever, they do the same thing. They pick these giant words that don't really add to
yeah.
what he's saying, doesn't really help transfer the ideas. That's how this book is written, Maps of Meaning. It's very, which again, in the style of Carl Jung, his icon, his self-professed idol. It's like there's no reason for all this extra language.
Well, it's funny. One of his rules in the 12 rules was be precise in your speech. So I wonder if that's how he justifies it, is that he's trying to be precise, because a lot of times, and I find vocabulary to be really interesting also, because a lot of times words are more precise. A lot of the words we don't typically use, and words that a lot of people don't know the definition to. It's kind of fun to look up the definition, because sometimes they're very good and precise words. So I wonder if that's part of what he's doing. But I will say, from a cynical standpoint, I believe that Jordan Peterson is a bit of a showman. And I think he's presenting himself in a particular way that makes him look like this professor character that knows all this deeper knowledge. And like there's a performance he's putting on to some degree or another, that very much casts himself as this wise academic. And I think using words, a more difficult vocabulary probably helps him with that. And it, projects smartness or projects intelligence, that he knows these big words, so I feel like he's doing a little bit of a performance every time he talks. And I shouldn't even say a little bit. I think there's a lot of performance every time he talks. And I think that's probably part of it.
Part of the act, which he is smart enough to go toe to toe with, like you mentioned, like the Jordan Peterson owns the libs YouTube compilations, which that's an interesting marketplace of ideas. Look, the X person owns libs compilation number 12, like Ben Shapiro or who,
Yeah, Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro both blew up in the similar way of like owning the libs, and they're both good at it, honestly. Like in terms of like a quick response to some typical liberal talking point, both of those guys are pretty talented when it comes to coming up with a response. But anyway, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No. But so I'll give him credit for that he's able to go on. He doesn't let himself get flustered. He has these debates. So people started learning more about Jordan Peterson. He started giving these online lectures a lot. And there was this group of young men who feel disenfranchised by modern society. They don't feel like their masculinity is wanted or needed. And actually, they feel like their society is telling them their masculinity is corrosive and harmful to progress of our society. Found a lot of solace in, I guess you could almost call them sermons, Peterson's lectures about finding purpose, using discipline to make yourself a better man so you can make a difference and be masculine and be a man, which I think is a very important conversation. And it also raises an interesting question, because he himself, he doesn't claim to be atheist or agnostic or whatever. Although there was one interview, I'll see if I can find it. There was one interview where he slipped up and said, I don't believe in God. But more often than not, he takes the line of, I don't answer those questions. I don't confirm whether I believe in God or not. But the idea that non-spiritual people can borrow the intellectual capital of religion and utilize them efficiently. Peterson's a case study of someone who tries to do exactly that. Is like, we shouldn't ignore, which I agree, like we shouldn't ignore religion. We shouldn't just cast religion to the wayside, but then trying to use the ideas promoted in those religions without actually subscribing to them and the different tenets of those faiths is an interesting attempt.
Yeah, there's a big part of me, and like in my writings, and books I've published in the past, like I love the idea that Christianity is good for the world, right? And I love that it has done so much good from a morality standpoint, from a caring for the weak standpoint. Like I love that, and I think it speaks well to Christianity. I think a lot of evangelicals have this sense of their sermons will be something along the lines of Christians are horrible. We've always abused everybody. We need to apologize for our past. Please join us. And it's a horrible evangelical effort. Is like, of course, who wants to join a religion that's done all this bad stuff? And one of the things I've always tried to point out is actually we've done amazingly good stuff throughout the years. And as a result, I like really appreciate it when a guy like Jordan Peterson or Nassim Nicholas Taleb, even though I don't think these guys are actually believers, I appreciate when they see what I'm seeing and they say it out loud, right? Like I think it's a good, for me, it's a very helpful thing. And I, from the standpoint of presenting religion and Christianity in particular in a positive light, I appreciate what he has to say, and I, anyway, so yeah, that's my thought on that.
Exactly. And then let's talk a little bit about Jordan Peterson's run with the intellectual dark web, which I think we could safely now say is defunct. It had a good run. Had a good run.
Yeah.
So intellectual dark web started about 2017, 2018. A bunch of these people, most of them with sort of leftist backgrounds, that were speaking against the mainstream progressive narrative for a variety of reasons.
Yep.
I think of Brett and Eric Weinstein,
Yep.
Sam Harris,
Yep.
Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson. Trying to think of some others.
Yeah, Joe Rogan wasn't one of them, but he organized them. They would go on his show and be, so he
discredited the whole IDW thing. Like he addressed it a couple times on his show. He's like, I hate that I'm people include me in that dumb circle of like, it's like we're just regular people that are just talking about stuff like intellectual dark web, we're the spooky, but like fair enough.
Yeah.
Well then
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Pain Burn Philosophy was a YouTube channel that I don't know how he swung this, but he started organizing all these talks, all of these. So they that's when Peterson started doing like the live. He would go to a different city and just come out and talk. I never attended one of those, but I had friends that would go and like, he just kind of comes out and sits down and says, all right, I feel like talking about this. And people were just eating it up. I was like, that's just crazy. Yeah. Guy just coming out and just BSing for an hour, and people were paying anyway.
Yeah, no, it's and those kind of conversations are interesting. Like you watch those videos, and Jordan Peterson, he's an interesting guy to talk to. Like if we had him on the show, I'm sure it would be an enjoyable conversation. Right? Yeah. Like I'm sure like it would be interesting, enjoyable. He seems like he has thick skin. You can poke him, you can whatever. Yes. Like, but I'm sure it'd be an interesting thing. So.
Absolutely. Yep. So then I mentioned Pain Burn Philosophy just because the IDW thing kind of died when they died. So they were setting up a talk in Australia. I think Eric Weinstein was supposed to show up and somebody else, whatever. And something happened where they had to cancel, and he wasn't going to refund the people who had bought tickets to see the show. And that caused great consternation. Eric Weinstein eventually stepped in, I think, and used his own money to help refund people who had bought tickets. And this guy basically set it up, and I don't know if he ran off with the money or he didn't know what he was doing. But there are still some interesting, like, so when Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson had that, there were like 4 debates right in a row. The first 2, I don't think are. Brett Weinstein is the moderator, and I like Brett. Like he's a good guy. He's not a debate moderator. He wasn't the right person for those roles. The last two, I believe both were moderated by Douglas Murray. And those are what I would point people to. So Sam Harris, like many other people, and I was an atheist at the time and appreciated Sam kind of digging into this, like, okay, you borrow religious ideas, but you don't confirm whether or not you yourself subscribe wholly to all of these ideas. So, like, why don't you? And will you please, so we understand where you're coming from?
Yeah.
Which brings me to my biggest bone to pick with Peterson. Like we talked about, he borrows a lot of these religious ideas, rightly or wrongly. And like you said, I too appreciate that he takes Christianity and puts it in a positive light. But he just addressed this again, this whole like, do I believe in God question. And I'll post the YouTube video, but he acknowledges, like, I know people ask me this and they get really perturbed by my answer.
That's a good impersonation. You got perturbed.
yeah by the complexity of, it's like, good Lord.
Yeah.
So his first major point is like, it's none of your damn business,
right?
Which, yeah, for anybody else, yeah, like if I asked you, hey, do you believe in God? It's like, that's personal. Okay, fair enough. To a public intellectual who himself uses the imagery, the metaphors, everything about the religion, it does
talks about it all day,
all the time.
Yeah,
it begs the question, hey, Dr. Peterson, do you believe in that these metaphors aren't just metaphors? That's a totally valid question, and to say it's none of your damn business is a dodge.
Yeah. There's something funny about him and other guys that are kind of pro-religion but actually not believers. And again, I don't know exactly what Jordan Peterson believes in his own heart, but it is funny because you can't get the positives from Christianity or any other religion unless you actually do believe it. Right. So it's great. Like some of the founding fathers, like Jefferson, had a similar attitude where it's like, oh, Christianity is really good for the world. Like Washington, Christianity is needed, in his final farewell address, talked about how important Christianity was to this country. But you can't get those positives just by saying Christianity is positive, right? Like, it's good. Christianity is a good thing, but it's not true. Like, why follow, like, it just, so it's almost like the people that were willing to lay down their lives to advance the abolition movement did so, taking stones, taking, personal risks, those kind of things. They did so because they believed that Jesus Christ wanted them to do that. Right. They didn't do so because, like, they thought Christianity had some positive effects on the world. Like, that wasn't, they had to have like true belief in order to do that. And that's a pretty big gap between thinking it's a, like with Taleb is like, he says, I like the fasts of Eastern Orthodoxy. They're good for, like, humans have built in these fasts so that we can, like, cleanse our system and get variety in our food and that kind of stuff, which is kind of cool. Yeah, neat. But like, that's a whole lot different than, I will die for this because this is true and Jesus Christ is calling me to do this. And if I die for it, God will raise me up again from the dead. Like, those are two very different things. Right?
Well, and this is such an important point. Like, you will not find a historical figure that says, like an abolitionist who is like, hey, Christianity says that slavery is wrong. I don't believe in Christianity, but I believe, a world without slavery is good. So I'm going to use Christianity to let that person doesn't exist.
Right.
And that person wouldn't be able to withstand the trials it took to endure to end slavery.
Yeah, or think of like the missionary in the mosquito-ridden woods, like trying to help people get enough food or cure a plague that's going through some tribe or something. And they're, I think of like guys that died in leper colonies, like trying to help the lepers or whatever. you don't do that kind of stuff because you generally have positive feelings towards the overall effect of Christianity on society. Like you
Yeah.
do that stuff because you believe literally that Jesus Christ is calling you to do it.
Which with Peterson, he's borrowing these ideas to give his audience metaphors to help them feel better. But like this, it is sort of like he's not trying to change the world. Like he's standing up against draconian language laws, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which then if you, so he got to start against the whole misgendering thing because language is important. Language is a cultural tool that has evolved over millennia, and we have to use. So remember, that's how he got to start. And now with his whole like, because so his second thing, his second point of why he doesn't answer this question is like, well, what do you mean by God? What God is to you might be different than what God is to me. Another dodge. Everybody knows what like even as
everybody knows what we're talking about here.
when I was an atheist, that was when I would like get really frustrated with Peterson. Was like, dude, even I don't even believe it. I know what God, like what people mean when they say, do you believe God exists?
Right.
I like everybody knows what this means. You're pretending it's this esoteric thing, which he wants another case of like he wants his cake and he wants to eat it too. When we're talking about misgendering, language is very concrete. It's very everybody knows what we're talking about. Then using that same idea with the idea of God. Oh, it's this big mystery. We don't know like what God is to you might be different than what God is to me.
Yep.
It's not consistent.
Yeah. And so I mean, my thought on does he really believe, like if I had to answer that question, I would say I think he's weirdly emotional on it, where I think there's some part of him that might sort of think it's true. On the other hand, like there's so much from him from a writing standpoint where it's clear he does not believe in the truth of the Bible. And that really comes out in the 12 Rules for Life. It comes out, and I've heard him in his speeches and stuff where in talking about the mythology of the Bible that generally speaking, he's positive towards, he also describes it in words and descriptions that are clearly undermine its historicity, right? So Jesus Christ, he loves the symbols of Jesus and all that stuff. But then he says, I heard him in one speech, I can't remember who, he said these are all pulled from this pagan myth story. Right. Like, so he's like, this is all pulled from this pagan myth. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, that's like a weird Bill Maher religious idea. And it's definitely not true. Like, and the New Testament is absolutely a historical document. You can argue whether the miracles are real or not, but like even liberal scholars understand the historicity of so much of that. So it was like a weird comment, but it also kind of undermined him as like a true believer. Is like clearly he doesn't believe in the historicity.
Well, so Lewis, you may not be aware, that was not an offhanded comment. That was one of the core tenets of his book, Maps of Meaning. This old myth where all religion derives from, including the Bible, that's a big part of Maps of Meaning. So that is something that he believes, that Christianity, like other religions, evolved from other sources, but this particular myth, the Gilgamesh, whatever, that's where all the stuff
in
comes
the case
from.
of Jesus Christ, like it's verifiably false, right? Like we can look, like we've got the historical documents, you can read like what happened there, there's links to real historical figures. It's like verifiably false that it was not based on those myths. There may be some parallels, right? And C.S. Lewis pointed that out, where he said the myths of old were all pointing to Jesus Christ. Like that's what C.S. Lewis said. It was like we have these images in our mind of what this world should be like, and then it's fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But the idea that it was based on those is a joke, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly. So I think that's maybe one of our quicker run throughs of somebody in their work. But I don't know, like what other comments you might have about Jordan Peterson. But yeah, like very interesting. Started a lot of really good conversations, and maybe after we did our Nassim Taleb episode, there were some of our Eastern Orthodox Twitter circles mentioned that actually, because Nassim Taleb, they don't believe that he's actually Eastern Orthodox, especially after his comments about how paganism was like the decentralized whatever he said. Had a lot of high regard for paganism.
He likes paganism.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
And when I was a fan of him, I could kind of feel that temptation for me also. And like, I had to wake myself out of it, or I'm like,
Yeah.
wait a second.
Yeah.
That's bad stuff. Like, it's bad, not good. Yeah,
right.
So.
Right. But he was a gateway for a couple of people to discover Eastern Orthodoxy. So they were kind of irreligious prior to Taleb, discovered Eastern Orthodoxy through Taleb, and are now devout Eastern Orthodox Christians. And in a similar way, I feel like there are a lot of people who've discovered or maybe rediscovered their Christian roots through Jordan Peterson's lectures about how the metaphors behind the religious stories in the Bible.
Yeah.
Like, so I'm not trying to trash him. I get frustrated with him because you see somebody who spent as much time studying the Bible as him and but stops as like, well, I like these ideas. I want to borrow these ideas. I want to borrow the Bible. I want to believe it on my own terms. I don't want to submit to all the other whatever baggage, whatever, like, Christians get really anxious about, like what you said, like, oh, Christianity's harmed the world, harmed women's rights and all these different, which if you know anything about world history, that's just monstrously false. But so many Christians are apologetic about that, or apologetic about the Old Testament. Like, I saw our favorite atheist, the tall, friendly atheist dad, talk about, so Josh Buis, how we pronounce his name, tweeted, Jesus is God, and tall, friendly atheist dad said, so then Jesus is complicit in the slaughter in the Old Testament. A lot of Christians get really like squirmy with like, I mean, kind of, because God's kind of, he's a little cruel. Yeah, he's a little. He does. It's like, we don't, and maybe Christian evangelical movement at large is guilty of that, where yes, I believe in these things, and these ideas, these problems, like with the Old Testament, whatever, I don't really want to flesh it out. It is God's kind of a grumpy, kind of a sadistic type of God in the Old Testament. So I'm just, Jesus, like the New Testament, God is love. God is like, now, we have this all loving God now after he killed his son. It's it's like, we need, although maybe you should flesh this out a little more.
Yeah, you read the book of Revelation, and Jesus is like slaying people, right? So he's
and the point I made on that Twitter thread was, like, I would argue, and as many people have, that Jesus has blood on his hands in the Old Testament too, like the angel of the Lord in 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35, where I think it's the Assyrians are camped outside of Jerusalem, and the angel of the Lord goes and slaughters 185,000 men. And the reason scholars think that might be Jesus is because other times when the angel of the Lord appears in the Old Testament and people worship him, he's the only angel that does not direct people to stop worshiping him. Other times where angels appear and people are like, oh my gosh, they're like, don't, I'm just a servant, I'm just a messenger, don't worship me.
That's interesting.
Angel of the Lord is the only angel that does not stop people from worshiping him, which Jesus, claiming to be God in the New Testament, you can worship Jesus as God because he is God. It would make sense that angel of the Lord is also Jesus. So, and to your point in Revelation, This is he's very warlike. He's not meek and mild Jesus with fire in his eyes and that's coming down to destroy his enemies. It's not meek and mild Jesus at all.
Yep. So yeah, there's a lot of the scriptures that are not PC with today's culture. There's no question. And like as Christians, you take that and you reflect on that, and like you have to be able to integrate that into your theology and your understanding of things. And I think it is refreshing when someone like Jordan Peterson or any of these other guys don't have that negative, because if you want to nitpick Christianity, if you want to tall friendly atheist dad, right? I love a guy, really nice guy, but he does that a lot where it's like pulling something, this one passage, and it's like, oh, this bad stuff. And like, it's a very atheist internet thing to do, right? Like where you take this ancient book that scholars debate and discuss, that is written in Hebrew and Greek and has all this context and has books written on every verse almost. And then you take that and you pull one little section out and you just look at the English translation and you draw dramatic conclusions and very simplified answer, and you post it online as a gotcha, right? Like that's a very non-nuanced way of understanding everything in there. And that's to get back to guys like Jordan Peterson or whatever, like I'm glad they're like more, instead of looking at the most simple horrible way of reading something, they're looking at what are the good elements of this, what are the that kind of thing, which is I always appreciate that, right? Like it's definitely not something that everybody's doing, and there's a value to it. And I in some ways I agree. Like I know people that have become either Christians or like friendly towards Christianity in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise been if it weren't for Jordan Peterson. Like if it was so I think there's a true value to what he's doing. I have mixed feelings on the man. Like I said, I kind of feel like he's phony at some point in time, and like he's at times areas where I'm an expert and he starts talking about it, I realize he doesn't know exactly what he's talking about, right? And like that always scares me, because I'm not an expert in all the other stuff he's saying. Is like, what are the odds that because he's wrong just in the area I'm an expert, right? Like maybe he's wrong in all those areas. And you see that with the news too, is like when the news will publish a story on your industry or like an issue that about, and you're like, whoa, wait a second, the news got that completely wrong. And then you realize, what are the odds that like them getting it wrong just in my area is every story they do really screwed up? And probably it is. Right. And I feel like maybe with Jordan Peterson there's an element of that too, is like how much does he screw up, all these tidbits and facts he tells these stories, and like how much are those, how accurate are those? And and I also with I know we've already talked, we're coming to the end here, but let me open something back up. But sure. The other thing I noticed was that he it's a little bit like when you look at a ink blot or whatever and you interpret it however you want. I noticed he does that with a lot of things, where he'll read a biblical passage or an ancient myth, and he will project onto that myth his idea of order and chaos, right? So like he's got these ideas of order and chaos and like this ideology that he promotes all the time. Then he'll read like the story of Pachamama and the Inca, and he'll say Pachamama and the Inca, and she did this and then she did this, And if you understand, that's order and chaos. And she was doing this and that. And it's like, no, that was a story about Pocky Mama, like growing plants in the back of the, like it has no like overlap, but like he'll interpret it through that framework. And he does it in a way that's compelling. But like if you are at all critical with what he's saying, you're like, wait a second, that's not what that story is about.
Which ironically enough is what got Joseph Campbell in hot water all the time. He would do the same thing, find ancient myths, find ways to make them relevant to a wider audience, whatever. And people are like, they're like, yeah, you're kind of pulling the story out of its context. You're ignoring this parts of the story and how the people who told the story use the story. So even though he ignores Joseph Campbell, and I think has even spoke critically of Joseph Campbell, he himself is guilty of the same thing.
Yep. Yeah, you see it all the time.
Yeah. If Dr. Jordan Peterson was listening to this podcast, what's something that I would say to him? I would say, hey, I really, like we've talked about, really appreciate your work in making people who might otherwise be irreligious to consider the utility of the Christian Bible, the Christian stories. But I would ask you, Dr. Peterson, be consistent. If you got your start in the public square as somebody who was critical of how we bend and use language to our own devices regarding transgenderism and misgendering and forced compelled speech, you've always argued that the language that we use is important. It's evolved for particular reasons, and we can't just discard it because it's out of vogue. I would charge you to take that same conviction and apply it to the idea of God. You know what everybody means when we say God. You know exactly what we mean. Stop saying that God is this esoteric term that we can't really actually define. You're the only person who believes that God is a hard word. Please be consistent and just answer the question. You appreciate Christianity, but
do you think there's some part of him that it's kind of like where people would trap Jesus, like you read the Bible and they're trying to trap Jesus. Should we pay taxes or not? Because there's like two parties. One was saying if you pay taxes, you're a traitor to the Jewish people and supporting them. And then on the other side, there's, if you say you don't pay taxes, that's an executable crime, right? Do you think that Jordan Peterson realizes if he says, yes, I'm an evangelical Christian, then he loses all his credibility kind of among academics and the Sam Harrises of the world and that kind of stuff? Or if he says, no, I'm not, he loses all his Christian audience or all the people that like kind of like you and me that like listen to him because he's kind of on our side or whatever. Like, do you think that for him, he's walking that line of like, I don't want to answer that question because it would alienate half my audience if I answer that question?
See, Lewis, I don't know if people appreciate your intellectual acumen. Like I did not realize that Jordan Peterson was Christ-like in his ability to navigate these, what people think are obvious questions. Jordan Peterson sees behind the veil.
That will be the title. The title of this episode is Jordan Peterson Christ? Question mark.
I don't think that he does that to appeal to both audiences and to keep his, I don't know that he's motivated by money or fame or whatever. I want to give him that credit. I don't think he's that person. I see what you're saying. I do think like he is genuine in that he does really believe that this is a conundrum, that he really believes that this is a difficult question. And like we've talked about, it really isn't. It's a question that people have been answering for a long time. But for Peterson, variety of reasons, the reasons he stated, which we've addressed two of the three that he recently gave. The first being, it's none of our business. The second reason is, what do you mean by God? But his third reason is really interesting, and people have been trying to analyze the third reason more, which is I'm afraid that God might exist. He's talked about this. I think his latest Joe Rogan podcast, he kind of fleshes that out a little more too. Like he sees the claims that the Bible makes. He sees the positive impact that Christianity has had on the world. So like you put all that together, that was a big reason why I came back to faith was, I mean, look at the evidence, right?
Mhm.
And what if Christianity is one of many religions and you measure each religion by its positive impact on the world? Christianity is leagues ahead of every other religion, I would argue.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
then he's afraid God might exist. So then what, like, I'd be curious to know, like, is he still fleshing that out, or is he still sitting on the sidelines and not fleshing this out more on personally? And if not, why?
Yeah, those are interesting questions. So Jordan Peterson, if you're listening, come on the podcast. Although I think I've insulted him too many times. He wouldn't come on, but he's got
Right.
thick skin, so maybe. Yeah, I don't know, but
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, that's this particular podcast. Like, subscribe. Lewis has a book out that you all should purchase and read and use it to stop doing drugs. Lewis,
It hit number one in its category.
Yeah.
And Mike Cernovich gave it a good review, which, by the way, hitting number one in the category, not that big of a deal, but like it was good. It was it showed that at least some people were reading it, and Mike Cernovich read it, which was shocking because he kind of was one of the people that inspired the book in a sense, because he has talked about psychedelics and he is in kind of our conservative Twitter sphere. So he's one of the guys that I actually thought about as I was writing the book, and talked about his comments on drugs a couple of times in the book. So the fact that he read the book and then gave a positive review and then tweeted that out, I mean, like, thank you, Mr. Cernovich. I really appreciate that. And I definitely helped some of the sales early on. The audio book is coming out next week. So anybody that is interested in listening to it, that should be out on, I think, Thursday, maybe Friday.
Nice.
The Audible people are like very indefinite on when you publish stuff. It's very annoying. So, anyway, so yeah, that's coming out, but check it out. It's called The Return of the Dragon. So if you search The Return of the Dragon and my last name, if you just search Return of the Dragon, you'll get Bruce Lee movies. But if you do The Return of the Dragon and UNGIT, you will get that as your number one result. And check it out. The ebook is only $3, and like I said, the audio book will be out this week. So
awesome. Thank you, Lewis. Like, subscribe, and let us know if you guys want us to flesh out a new idea. Next time, maybe we'll go into Sam Harris or Chris Hitchens, or maybe some other public intellectual. Watching Sam Harris, the Trump derangement syndrome continuing to rot out his brain it's been really sad, honestly.
Trump has broken so many people. Regardless of what you think of Trump as a human being, it is amazing how he's like this human being breaker, right?
Yes.
Like, people will have this like facade they put on, and then when they run into Trump, it's just like they melt down. And
oh my gosh,
it's crazy. Like it's very interesting effect that Trump has on a lot of people. So you learn a lot from that. So
absolutely. All right,
we'll
see you guys next time. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.